Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that very much. How many of you have had experienced calls from a deaf person on your 911? Let me just see who we're talking to here. Okay. Were those calls by TTY or some other means? All TTY? Relay, okay. How many of you have had TTY calls? Isn't that a slow, painful process? And everybody in the world feels that way, and that's why everything has gone toward this relay system. I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and what I've been involved in with deaf and sign language. I am a certified interpreter through National Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID, and I have been working mostly in the religious world with interpreting, although I've done many other things and spoken in many different countries to deaf people as well. We are involved in a ministry called Silent Word Ministries, and you have a newspaper on your desk there, and also a little card that has the ABCs on it. And a lot of people are under the misimpression that sign language is a lot of ABCs and things. That's a little bit of it, but there are signs for pretty much everything that needs to be said, and but they're not used consistently around the country. In other words, there may be signs varying in different regions. The vast majority of American Sign Language is the same around the country. It is different in different countries. So those are some interesting things to know about American Sign Language. Let me give you some definitions to begin with. We'll start with this. And I want to give these to you from a perspective of deaf people. This is not really a textbook definition, but this will help you understand the people that we're talking about when we're talking to deaf people or hearing impaired people. First term, of course, is hearing impaired, and generally speaking, the only people that use that are hearing people. Deaf people do not consider themselves hearing impaired, they consider themselves deaf. I'll get into that in just a moment. And there's another group of people that are not just deaf, and so we'll address that as well. But that's a term that's generally used for the whole gamut of hearing loss. Then also, deaf. Deaf people define themselves as a cultured group of people, and they're ASL users, American Sign Language. American Sign Language is its own language. It has, it's a visual language, it's a gestural language. It cannot be written down. So anytime you've taken a TTY call, they're thinking in American Sign Language, trying to transpose that to English, and what you see and what is being read to you through the TTY interpreter, or if you have a direct line TTY, then what you're reading there is a broken English, because deaf people learn English as a second language. And so what they're thinking in and what they're trying to write at the same time are two different things. And that's why things look weird. In American Sign Language, much like Spanish, we change the order of words. In fact, American Sign Language is closer in grammar structure to Spanish or some other foreign language than it is actually to English. We get our American Sign Language from France. That could be part of the reason for that. But also it could be that it's a more natural way to communicate. Sign language, by its very nature, requires not only the hands, but also the eyes, the body positioning. We use things that are not in English grammar, such as placement. A deaf person will put a person over here and just set them up like they're doing a drama for you. They'll set them up and then they'll point after that. Well, if they didn't tell you to begin with that was a male or female, the interpreter is going to have a hard time. If you're watching on relay, the interpreter doesn't know if it's a male or female. And so to use the question, to use the he or she, sometimes they don't know. And so they may say the individual or the person. And that's maybe why you're seeing some of the things you see on this. Relay interpreters are highly qualified, but deaf people vary a great deal, and so it's hard for them to get to be skilled with every one. In fact, sometimes they'll switch off, and you might have experienced that as well. Also, another definition here, hard of hearing. Deaf people classify those that cannot hear very well as hard of hearing. They don't call them hearing impaired. They actually call them HH, hard of hearing. And hard of hearing person is an interesting person because they don't really fit in the deaf world, in the deaf culture. Deaf culture is unique in that it is a visual perspective on everything, and they have certain aspects of their culture that are, how would we say it, they're not Americanized in culture in some ways. And so they're like a different foreign group of people. Hard of hearing people don't fit into that culture very well because possibly they're attached to the hearing world a good bit, and so they may more attached to the hearing world, or just in this middle area, and have a real difficult time fitting in either group of people. So hard of hearing people are in between. When you're taking a call, you may be taking a call from someone that is hard of hearing that is using sign language, and their sign language may not be as good as a deaf person. And so that's hard of hearing. By deaf definition, and this is my definition based on deaf people, and what I have used, what I've observed over a period of time, is that deaf people look at hearing people as those who do not understand their language or their culture. That's the way they look at us. They look at, in fact, I read something yesterday that says, hearing people can do everything that deaf people can do except sign. Which is kind of a backwards way of looking at things. But hearing people are generally people that do not understand deaf people. And they look at us that way. So anything we can do to accommodate into that or learn as much as we can about deaf people, then that'll help greatly. And then interpreters are those that are qualified in sign language to be able to communicate with deaf people, not only to communicate, but actually to interpret. Sign language and knowing sign language and speaking in sign language is different than interpreting. Interpreting is a wholly separate skill because in interpreting, culturally and language mediates. It mediates between deaf culture and what we call hearing culture. And then also between American Sign Language and English, if that's our language we're communicating in. So an interpreter knows how to go between those things and make we call it mediation, so that what the deaf person is saying in sign language comes out clearly in English, and what you're saying in English comes out clearly in sign language, even though the interpreter may not be signing the exact words that you use. When the deaf person is speaking, signing, and an interpreter is talking to you, they are actually adapting what is being said. So there's a lot of leeway in this. The interpreter is a very powerful part of this whole equation. And so they're trained highly with confidentiality and being able to communicate clearly what has been said into the English language. So those are interpreters. A couple of other definitions for deaf. Deaf person there are two definitions. The clinical definition is basically something that needs to be fixed. Doctors look at deaf people as having a hearing loss, and we can fix that. Doctors always are trying to fix things. And you're familiar with that. You know, you're by the nature of 911, someone arrives at the scene, they're trying to fix something. Well, hearing people tend to look at deaf people as that, in that methodology. Deaf people look at themselves as a cultured group of people, people that are normal by every means, except they communicate with a different language. That being the case, they look at us as a foreign group of people. So when they are thinking about calling a hearing person, they're realizing, okay, this may not come out like I really would expect. Now, that's just by the very nature of communication with deaf people. I cannot tell you the number of times a deaf person and a hearing person would speak, both nod, both agree, and they go off and do different things because it just was not clear. So clarity is something that's highly valued in the deaf community. They value clear, direct communication in sign language. Deaf people say that hearing people go like this. Here's the point, and hearing people are going like this. They never get to the point. We use words that describe things that are not clear. When someone is large, we call them, what other words would you use for that?
Heavy.
Heavy. Okay, obese, overweight, things like that. Deaf people have basically one way of describing that. Okay, depending on the size, and they will mime the actual size wherever the largeness is. If they have a large neck, they'll do it this way. If they have other things that are large, they'll describe. So they're visual, and they're very visually oriented. Hearing people try to beat around the bush to avoid all that. Deaf people prefer direct communication. They prefer you be really clear and say exactly what you mean.
Political correctness.
Yeah. They don't like political. They like being, they say exactly what they mean. And so, that's the group of people we are. And that's, I say we. Once you're involved in that community a lot, you tend to go that direction. In fact, we've said about our kids often that we raise them like deaf kids. Because culturally speaking, they are deaf in many ways. Our daughter, sweet young lady, but she's very direct in what she says. And she'll just say straight on what she means. I was interpreting or teaching a sign language class in college. I learned in 1976, interpreters were not very plentiful back then. And and those who knew sign language were very few. And so I was actually teaching a college class after hours, was not getting paid for it. Had a class of about 100 students. Well, we had a deaf person come in, and he was going to be speaking that day, so we were videotaping him. And as he came up to speak, I'd given an introduction, and my daughter, seeing this videotape, she was about 16 years of age, she said, "Dad, you signed lousy back then." And just very straightforward and blunt, where hearing kids may not say that. Well, Dad, you really didn't have as good as signing skills back then. Of course, teenagers tend to be more blunt anyway. So anyway, that's the deaf people we work with. All right. Basic devices, you're probably familiar with a lot of this, but standard hearing aids vary greatly. The purpose of a hearing aid is just to amplify sound. That's all that it does. If there's noise, it amplifies noise. All right. Amplification systems, they vary greatly. Some deaf people, mostly hearing impaired people, hard of hearing as we would call them, will use amplification devices. I know several that will actually have a device they hang around their neck, and they'll have a hearing aid in, but they have a device hanging around their neck that will actually pick up sound and go into their hearing aid. Many hearing aids will have a T-switch. Most of them probably do now. I'm not that familiar with that technology. Will have a T-switch, which stands for telephone, which allows them, if they're on a standard telephone, they can put it on T and it blocks off all the sound that's coming here, and it only uses electromagnetic waves from that headset, so that all they're hearing is what's coming across the headset. That helps in many situations, especially talking on the telephone. Well, they have a device that hangs around the neck that actually creates that signal as well, so it will pick up certain, it can be directional or whatever, pick up certain things and actually go directly into the hearing aid without going through the sound channel. This device is actually, so that may be what you're seeing some of this right here. The one on the right is called a loop. The reason is it has a loop. It's a closed loop that transmits. Cochlear implants. A cochlear implant is a device that is actually implanted into the head, into the semicircular canal, into the cochlea, and it's a wire that goes in there that actually bypasses all of the external ear. The eardrum, the hamel, the anvil, all of that. It bypasses all of that and goes directly into the nerve part of the ear, so that sound can be, from out here, can go directly inside the head without having to pass through any of the outside parts. As you'll see here, that part that's on the back of the head is magnetic. Now this may be something that you'll face if you're dealing with somebody that's cochlear implant. That part can fall off in emergencies when people are moving quickly, or when they have been struck or they fall. That part can fall off. It's only held on by a magnet. There is a metal plate on the inside of the skin which goes down into the semicircular canals, and then this part that you see, the round part on the top there, which you see just attaches by a magnet. The other part just hangs on there, and that uses your ear to pick up the sound to go into this device to be transmitted into the ear. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? And they've improved over the years. Many years ago I heard that hearing through one of these devices was kind of like hearing an AM radio that was about 5 kilohertz off. So you heard a lot of static, a lot of crackling. Rush Limbaugh is a famous person that got one of these devices a while back, and he had to actually learn to hear over again. People that get these devices, even though if they're hearing and they've lost their hearing and they get one of these devices, they have to learn again because things sound different. Music does not come across well on these, just by way of information. And So these, and a deaf person that hears with one of these learns to hear, but he doesn't hear like you and I hear. And I've known several deaf people that have gotten these. Some have liked them, and some have not. It's quite an expensive operation. Naturally, you have to cut open the head from here back, lay this open, and do all the operation, get all the wires in there properly, place all this back. And so it's quite expensive, and yet some have gotten it done, put it on, used it for a couple of months, and said, don't like it. And so they never wear it again. Interesting. From a hearing perspective, you would think, well, anything to be able to hear again would be great. From a deaf perspective, they look at it and say, why would I want to hear it? It's noise. And that's, I mean, they're deaf. They don't hear like we hear. One other thing about these devices and how they work, usually, if I didn't bring a chart here, but if you had a chart of hearing, high decibels, low decibels, or high frequency, low frequency, that is, the chart may look something like this, or it may go like this fine and have a drop in it like this. So a hearing person in their hearing, they may not hear certain frequencies. Today's hearing aids are tailored to fit into those frequencies and amplify those frequencies more than the frequencies around. And they can actually be computer controlled. You can actually plug your hearing aid into a computer, certain hearing aids this way. In fact, Ted Camp in our ministry has one of these. And you just plug it into your computer, and his hearing aid specialist is in Pennsylvania. And he can go in there and just, okay, I fixed it for you. And it's just amazing how all that works. But that's back on the other part. These are cochlear implants. And then, now I mentioned down at the bottom here, most deaf people, or many deaf people, prefer not to wear hearing aids because of a variety of reasons. It's cumbersome, it's noisy, it doesn't help like they want. Some deaf people even don't want to wear hearing aids because it associates with hearing culture. Now that's how strong deaf culture and hearing culture are perceived by a deaf person. So some of them will not wear a hearing aid, which to us sounds odd. You know, you can get any help you can to be great. To them it's more, I've got all the help I need. I know sign language, and all my friends know sign language. What else do I need? I have an interpreter. I'm good. They live in a whole different world. Any questions up to this point? Anything that's struck you as interesting or odd or... Yes, ma'am.
You said English was like a second language to them, or they're not used to communicating in a way.
Typically.
How does that translate to reading and writing?
Yeah, with our newspaper and all, we tend to write, in our ministry, we tend to write very simple English. Simple English works much better when you're dealing with somebody that is a second language person. So we try to write in a way that is easily signed. I'll give you an example of that. For the word like, you look like someone else, okay? Or I like ice cream. Okay, there are two different definitions there. Well, typically deaf people will associate a word with a definition. They won't go down the gamut of definitions. We as hearing people have heard them used in many different ways. So we'll take, in writing for deaf people, what we'll do is we'll find the word that accurately describes what we're talking about and use that in the newspaper. When you're talking with deaf people, that'll be the same thing. We choose not the word like, which means an affection, or to like ice cream. We choose the word as. And so instead of the word like, we'll choose the word as. So you write a lot more simply, and if you have a knowledge of sign language and what would be signed, we typically try to choose the English word that's connected with the sign that we want. So sometimes when a hearing person is reading our materials, they may say, well, why did you write it that way? It's a little bit odd. You could have said it better this way. Well, our target audience is deaf people. So yes, good question. And many deaf people read marginally. Some read excellent. We had a deaf man travel with us one summer. We lived in an RV, and asked him to come and travel if he'd like, and he did. And he was studying for the ministry. We found out a lot of things by doing that. One of the interesting things was he was a prolific reader. And he would finish a book that's this thick in 3 days, which a lot of hearing people won't do that. And so he just read all the time. He grew up, incidentally, from deaf parents, deaf grandparents. In fact, every time he introduced himself, he would say, I'm fifth generation deaf. And he would explain it. All his aunts and uncles were deaf, his grandparents were deaf, and all of that. In the deaf community, that gave him status. It was amazing. When he would say that, hearing people think, oh, that's terrible. That runs in your family. That's awful. Deaf people would say, wow. Isn't that interesting? It's a whole different mindset of people that we deal with. And unlike someone who moves to America and learns our culture, deaf people do not experience our culture as much because they do not live in our world. They live in a quiet world. And so, yes, visual communication on page is difficult for them, and we have to make special accommodations for that. You probably noticed that in TTY calls. Yes?
I have a very good friend of mine that's from Puerto Rico. He's deaf. The only English language he knows is ASL.
Interesting. Interesting. And so, it was very fascinating. We have a deaf man lives in Trenton, and he wanted to call his mom up in Dominican Republic. Well, relay service would call there for free, so he could just call a relay operator and call the Dominican Republic, no problem. The technology, that's awesome. It was the first time he'd ever talked directly to his mom.
Wow.
And so he called up and said, hey, Mom, it's me. You know, and she says, it's not you, that's a lady's voice. You know? He had to explain, no, I'm using an interpreter, because the interpreter's not at liberty to explain that. He had to explain that. So he explained, I'm using an interpreter, and they talked, and he said, that was awesome. I could talk to my mom using the phone. Of course, he was using sign language, and the interpreter was actually interpreting from American Sign Language into Spanish for the mom. So, you know, you're not, American Sign Language is not connected only to English. It is a language all its own and can be translated into any other language. Okay, anything else? Other questions up to this point? Okay, let's look at the next thing, ways deaf people communicate. And we'll be passing out these handouts if you'd like them at the end of this time. Basic things, I think we've already communicated this. Deaf people are very connected to their American Sign Language. This is the #1 way a person can gain status with deaf people, is to use their language well. Of course, we connect with hearing people that use language well too. If you have somebody off the mountain, I won't say what mountain or where, okay? If you have somebody out in the sticks, okay, and they call in and they can't use language well, you have a preconceived notion about that person, isn't that true? And you can just imagine their home and where they are and all this stuff, and how they're dressed, and I mean, you can imagine all of that just from hearing their voice. Well, deaf people do the same thing. They're very connected to their language, and as we use their language well, then they accept us more so. Often, hearing people that sign well and are not using English at the same time, a deaf person will say, are you deaf or hearing which? Are you deaf? And they'll ask that question because there's no way to tell the difference between a deaf person and a hearing person. If the language is being used correctly, there's no way they can know unless you do something like turn away. And they say, why did he turn away? There must be a hearing person. Because deaf people don't do that. Deaf people get a visual clue and then they look. All right. Secondly, historically, deaf people have a strong dependence on interpreters and have had for years. At first, the interpreters were not very good or not very plentiful. The good ones were not very plentiful. And so deaf people would rely upon their children to interpret. In fact, even today, often in an emergency situation, there may not be another interpreter there. You might receive a call from someone, a child, who is interpreting for their parents. I knew a deaf person hearing person who had deaf parents, and so he was the interpreter. Well, as I think less than a teenager, he actually had to interpret for his parents' divorce. This was many years ago. Can you imagine? And so deaf people, though, that's how they communicate with the hearing world, is through interpreters or through people that know their language well. And so they have a strong dependence on interpreters. In fact, there's even a joke along that line. A crippled person using a cane was getting ready to die. What's your last request? I want to be buried with my cane. A blind person, last request. What would you want? Well, I want to be buried with my seeing eye dog. Okay, we can deal with that. Okay, deaf person, last request. Well, I want to be buried with my interpreter. They view interpreters as a tool to be used, not necessarily as a friend. And in the interpreting world, there's a distinction made between an interpreter and a friend. An interpreter is somebody that is actually getting paid to do what they're doing or is doing it in a professional capacity. A friend is somebody that may know sign language and can watch and make sure the interpreter is doing his job, but is not there to actually provide the interpreting. Anybody, just anybody that knows sign language cannot necessarily be an interpreter. There are 4-year degrees to become interpreters. Before I was certified, and I'm sharing all this by way of purpose here. Before I was certified, I was in Central Texas and was talking to a deaf man at an agency, and he said, "Would you mind interpreting for me at a town hall meeting?" And so I agreed to do that, not really knowing at the time, not certified, not familiar with the process, not knowing that there were going to actually be certified interpreters there. Also, we were there and getting ready for the meeting, and he was telling me what all was going to be going on. Then 2 ladies showed up in black dresses. I knew who they were. You know, interpreters always wear black. Okay, not really, but it is a very neutral color and easily, good contrast for light-skinned people only. Okay, a dark-skinned person would naturally wear a different color. And so they showed up, and he said, "They're my interpreters. Would you get rid of them? Just tell them they can leave." I said, "I'm not going to do that. They're your interpreters. You tell them to leave." And so he went over there and signed their papers, and they got paid a 2-hour minimum when I was volunteering for this job. This is before certification, and before I realized what all was going on. And actually, I was doing it out of the goodness of my heart for that, not to get a pat on the back, just to say that was the situation. And so afterwards, I asked him, I said, "Why did you not want the certified interpreters to interpret here for you?" And he said, "Don't understand that." I said, "What?" He said, "I understand you, I don't understand them." Which is to make the point that you don't have to be certified to be understood. Just because this person is certified does not mean they'll be understood. However, generally speaking, it'll be the certified interpreters that will be the higher communication skills. I grew up for many, many years knowing sign language, and so that helped. All right? Some issues that are dealt with in this regard. Confidentiality with interpreters. Interpreters are held to confidentiality much the same way I would assume that you would. You can't go talk about something after hours. Hey, I had this neat call and it was da-da-da-da. You can't do that. Well, interpreters are the same way. If an interpreter breaks confidentiality, they are blacklisted in the deaf community. And the deaf community is a very tight-knit community. I know an interpreter that spilled the beans. This interpreter was interpreting in a situation in a church, and then also had some contact with a government agency dealing with some child abuse. This interpreter, having interpreted in both of those situations and in very confidential settings, at school where this person was also interpreting, said something to one of the teachers about one of those situations. The deaf people immediately said, "Can't trust that interpreter." And from that, it's been years, and I don't know that the deaf still trust that interpreter. They are very strong on confidentiality because they are a small group and a closed community. They tend to remember things a long time. So that may give you some insight into that. Second thing is, with interpreters, accuracy is key. Deaf people value accuracy very highly, and they want interpreters to be accurate. So their connection with the language and all of this is very strong, and they value to making that communication clear, very, very clear. Any question on that part of things? Comments? Okay, devices. The TTY you're familiar with very commonly. Voice carryover. Has anybody done a voice carryover call? You're familiar with voice carryover. That is, and it's still done today even with the newer devices, but voice carryover was when a deaf person would speak and then the relay interpreter would type back to them. So they would read it in English on the screen and the deaf person would speak. Generally speaking, hard of hearing people, hearing impaired people, not necessarily a deaf person using American Sign Language. So, and that would be it's kind of an interesting thing. You're actually hearing their voice, but they are actually seeing your response on the screen. The advantages is that most deaf people have this in their homes, At first, the devices started as huge, large, heavy devices. Like in the CBS Evening News from years and years ago, I see some young faces, you wouldn't recognize that, but you heard that in the background? Well, that teletype is where that came from. And so they used teletype machines. They got smaller. They were called TDDs, telecommunication device for the deaf. The deaf community in general did not accept that term, at least the ones that I was around. And so they kept the term TTY, even though the TTY, telecommunication, or the teletype writer, was not really what was being used. It was the TDD. But they use that same terminology. So it's interchangeable, TTY, TTD. They were available free by some agencies. In the state of Florida they were. Other states got on board later. Disadvantages, a lack of typing skill really affected the communication. And so a deaf person may not have known how to say what they're trying to say. They didn't have an English word for it. So they chose something in sign language, used the English word that was connected to that, and it didn't work. Now let me tell you a deaf joke just to make that point. Deaf humor is a little different than hearing humor, so I'll do this in sign language and use my voice as well so you'll catch what's being said, but it'll make the point about the word, choosing the right word to say in written format. A deaf man was driving along and he stopped. He saw up here train, many different cars. It was a railroad crossing. There was a little shack there where a man inside it had the lever to open and close the gates. So the deaf man just waited, and the train went by. And thinking the man would open up, he waited and waited and waited. He didn't open the gates. Okay? So he got out, he walked up to the little shack, and he looked at the man, woke the man up, and he's trying to sign to this man. And he didn't understand. So he took out a piece of paper and wrote. And he wrote down the words B-U-T-P-L-E-A-S-E. And the hearing man looked at it and said, "But please. But please." The deaf man's like, and the hearing man goes, and the deaf man's going, "Stupid hearing person, he doesn't know how to do what I'm trying to tell him to do." Okay? Now, the sign for but is, and so that's why he chose that word. Isn't that interesting? Now, that you may have related to some of your previous calls. Like, why do they have, why is that word there? That may be, may relate to somebody. If you tell that joke to hearing people, they go, "Oh, that's kind of cute." Deaf people go, right, meaning hearing people are stupid. Okay? Now, so this works both ways, you see, okay? We look at them as having the disability, and it's actually us that has the communication handicap, all right?
We're deaf impaired.
We're deaf impaired, exactly. That's what they call that. So that's exactly what we are. All right, and English second language, we mentioned that earlier. I just muted things, sorry. Okay, these are pictures of devices. This is, of course, the TTY device, and then that's the mobile version of it. So if a person had an emergency years ago, they had to go find a phone that had a TTY, because you don't just carry this device around with you, even though they're fairly lightweight, and they did have portable versions that actually could fit in your pocket. I have one that's it's foldable. You put it in your pocket, but they really were not very portable. All right. Newer devices, video phone, VP relay, voice carryover still applies, texting, email, Skype, and any number of online services that can be visual in nature. The advantage of these, they're more accurate in the communication of the message. The reason being, either you have a deaf person talking to a deaf person, or a deaf person talking to a hearing signer, or you have a deaf person going through an interpreter who can clearly voice what is being said. So that is an advantage. They're more readily available. These devices are given out by certain agencies just to get a deaf person to use their particular service, and there are numerous agencies that use these. The disadvantage is some deaf technologies, or some technologies are cumbersome and not compatible, and the interpreter skill varies on different agencies. That's a big thing right now between different agencies. One will say, our interpreters are better than their interpreters. And the other ones will say, we have more interpreters than they. You don't have to wait as long. And so there's a lot of competition in that area, any number of agencies. This is what a video phone device looks like. This device will be sitting on top of a TV or placed near a, now with the flat screens, I was thinking this through yesterday, I said, what do they do with flat screens? I don't have one of these, I'm not deaf. This is by the company called Sorensen VRS, Video Relay Service. You've probably had a Sorensen call, they're very popular, they're one of the first in the market. And they gave away these devices. This is the 200 version, the 100 version was a little less fancy. But they sit on top of the TV typically, and so you'll see a deaf person looking above your eyeballs. They're not looking into you because they're having to watch you on the TV screen. So, and that ring around the front is what flashes if someone is calling them. They can also have that hooked up to lights around their house, so that if you end up having to call someone back, I don't know how that works with your system, but if you have a number where you can call them back, then that would flash in their house if they're on a mobile system or a fixed system like this. This is wired directly to the internet, does not need a computer. So that the simplicity of this is tremendous. You'll have a little remote like this, it'll have numbers and all the different functions on it. They can just type in the number, press enter, and if it is a hearing person, if they're calling a hearing person, it will actually call an operator, and then the number will go through and the operator will interpret. If they're calling another person with a device like this, it will go directly through, it'll flash, and then they can communicate in sign language, no interpreter needed. That's typically what is done. In the future, if you were to ever get interpreters here, then that's the way you would work. You would work directly with a device like this. It may not be this company, but something similar to that. All right. This is what a deaf person will see on their screen when they're using a VP. They will be in one place, I can't tell you which is which. I imagine the person in black is the interpreter. Okay? And then the one down here will be the deaf person. And the deaf person will see themselves generally on the bottom of the screen, or they can just make the interpreter big and not see themselves at all. They'll be able to see themselves on the bottom of the screen for several reasons. One is that they can remain positioned inside of the square where the camera can see them. Okay? Now, naturally, if you're taking a call and an emergency is going on, if they step away from the camera, I mean, the camera doesn't follow them. So if they step away from the camera, then the interpreter just lost everything. They can't tell what's going on there. And typically, the emergency doesn't happen right in front of the television. So, that's just the way it works. So they will see this, and they will be working with it. If it was another deaf person, then instead of the interpreter there, they would actually be a deaf person, and whatever background. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, is there sound so the interpreter can hear like background noises or?
There is sound available. The person on their device, on their remote control, can turn off sound. They can enable or disable sound. That's on the device we have at our office. We have actually one of these at our ministry office. I am not sure if all devices have that.
I just wondered, because a lot of what we deal with is if we're not getting verbal, we depend on what we're hearing in the background.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times,
Yeah.
maybe the interpreter can hear something in the background too.
Yeah. Many times the sound is disabled. In fact, for privacy reasons, deaf people will even disable the video. They can disable it so they actually have to push a button to turn on so the interpreter can see them. That's the mute button for them. And so typically, I shouldn't say typically, but it would be very common to have the sound actually turned off and would have to be manually activated. Yeah. And they do that because they don't want people to hear their kids in the background or whatever else is going on. Like, okay. Deaf people tend to be very private. They tend to not want to share information. We have a guy that I was dealing with one day, and he was calling a financial agency, and he had to give them the Social Security number. He looked at me, and I was doing this as a friend, not as an interpreter necessarily. He looked at me and said, "Should I give him my number?" And it's up to you, whatever you want to do, And he was very reluctant to give out the number. And then when we got done, he said, "Now, don't you ever write down that number." I'm your friend. I don't want to, but he doesn't trust for things like that. I never wrote it down. I just voiced what he was giving me as a number. He had all the documentation, but they tend to be very private. So that may play into some of what you're doing sometime. All right. Texting. Some devices use email for texting. Normal texting is from phone to phone, phone number to phone number, naturally. Before that happened, with the deaf world, there were devices given out, not given out, you had to buy them, that were little text messaging devices they would carry around as their phone. This was before texting became popular with hearing people. And you could buy this device. It had no phone capabilities. It was only a screen at the top and keyboard at the bottom. And with that was attached an email address. It wasn't a phone number. Now, many devices actually will still use that technology today, and they will vibrate when that email comes in. I know personally, I have texting that I'll communicate with some hearing people, not many. I actually use email communication for many of the deaf people that I communicate with. And on their devices, they will have an email address. So it vibrates for them when the email address, when somebody comes in the email. And then I'll have another one for actual email that doesn't ring at 2 o'clock in the morning when things happen. You know, if you get a junk email from someplace. But they will have often the email attached to that. And then, and by the way, with email, naturally you're going to have a little bit more delay than you would actually with a phone number to phone number, has been my experience. I don't know if that's the experience here or not. Email is used the same as hearing people, and then Skype and other online services. Those are generally some of the devices that are used today. Have you seen anything else or questions on any other kind of devices that may be available?